Uh,
It's the first day of spring break for us, so I've got my oldest here to join on his first open source CNCF tag security meeting.
nice. Got a Solomon Leon.
Is he working on some more Star Wars Lego set in the background, or what's he up to?
Hopefully moving to Star Trek.
Did you get your headphones working, Sean?
And I also have I've inherited Brandon's audio issues somehow. They're
How
contagious.
about now?
I am good now. I'm here, everyone.
Okay. You missed Justin's question of whether he was building another Lego creation.
He is actually. We have the Razor Crest up to finish putting together. So would be a good way to spend the next couple days. Well, thanks everybody for joining. Pull up thanks Michael for that.
I guess I have a quick announcement as we're getting started, I guess, just that the Entoto is accepting nominations for their steering committee. And folks asked me to share that with the group if anyone is interested in participating in that. I'll post a link in the notes doc.
Exciting times. It's super awesome to see the overall traction that Entoto has gotten in the last year or so between Salsa and Sigstore and sure tons of other things I don't even know about.
Yeah, I think this new governance is hoping to kind of coordinate all that new stuff. So pretty exciting.
Yeah, we're trying to make it clear it's not just we want broad participation from adopters and other people like that in the steering committee. We don't want to just have kind of a BDFL model or just, a small, not very diverse set of people.
Right. And then we also have the open call still for the papers for the KubeCon EU Security Village, I think until tomorrow. I don't know if there's a specific time for the deadline, but
I think we put midnight Eastern time. If you submit 1 minute later, I think we'll accept it, but
Cool. All right. So in the working doc, I've been trying to figure out I think we're like a month in now. Still trying to figure out what is policy. Yes, and maybe not so much just like that high level question, but more the question around like what do we want to accomplish, and where are I think the important question that's come up in conversation so far is like, where are the gaps between the previous work done and the direction we want to go, and how can we make something that's useful. So one of the things that I put in the notes doc here, and I'll share the link to the doc, and I will also share my screen, just at least to start with. I can find which is the right application to share. Oh, I've lost all the cameras. All right. So I think when I looked at the best practices guide and also the reference architecture, a lot of it is framed from the software factory perspective of you have inputs coming in, and then you have a result at the end, whether it's an application that's running or it's the artifact that's produced and distributed. And when I think of policy and kind of what I'm thinking about in those papers, they miss this kind of infinite loop perspective. And I know this is like heavily overused. And I explicitly chose one that was not a DevSecOps infinity loop because I didn't want to bias the audience in terms of things we could think about here as far as the gaps go. But I think the papers miss some, or they don't address, I think it's intentional, some of the, we talked about like day two concerns and other things like this of like, after you have gone through this process of inputs to outputs of your supply chain, what happens over time? And I think that's where the policy becomes interesting and helpful. Or at least I think we could do something useful.
So one thing I noticed about this diagram, and I'm not criticizing the diagram, there's a huge misconception that I see repeatedly from people who haven't steeped in this for more than a decade, that the supply chain security issue is around their particular node in a very large graph, right? So I have my inputs, I do whatever I do in this happy little infinite loop, and I produce my outputs. And that mental misconception produces profoundly bad results. And so while I like where you're going here with getting to the fact that there's a different temporality to many things going on in supply chain security, I am somewhat concerned that this diagram contributes to that misconception.
I think that's a fair point. And one of the things we've talked about as well is the recursive nature of this when we look at dependencies and how they get pulled in and how to evaluate that. Let me just talk through a couple more things here, and then we can see how to maybe try and make that more clear, if possible.
Yeah, no, just to be super clear, I'm not criticizing your underlying point. I'm just lightly criticizing how we present it so we don't produce other problems.
Sounds good.
I brought up in the last few meetings that that I had tried to capture like the dependency levels that like that some measurements are applied to. So what I had created was like a salsa matrix that had all the levels, and then there's like a on the x-axis it's got all the levels, and on the y-axis it's at a dependency, like what dependency level are they applied to. So level, like for example, level 1 is like just the project level. Level 2 is project and direct dependencies. Level 3 is project direct dependencies and transitive dependencies. Level 4 is all the way down to I know, compute, and 5 is like firmware and lower, which I don't expect anyone to hit 5, but at least that gives us an idea of, at what level are folks applying, their controls on.
Yeah, and so is this something you've done that's above and beyond the sort of standard salsa stuff that I would normally have seen?
Yeah, it does.
If I could ask you to post a link in here, that would be fantastic. I do apologize. I'm coming to this conversation somewhat later.
Yeah, I had an action to put that in the notes. I'm still trying to figure out if this is the right forum for it, though. So Cole has his hands up.
Sorry, I was on mute there. Hey, so when I think of supply chain policy, whether it's automated policy where you have some controller making a decision, or whether it's a human, what they're doing is evaluating attestations about the process, right? So you may have a vendor onboarding process, right? They have to be approved. That's one attestation that they would have. Then maybe that they have to go through some financial validation process within there, right? There's a bunch of sub processes within that vendor onboarding. So that's like one section, right? That's completely separate from actually building the software. Then we have, when you're building the software, right, we need to have attestations about the people who went into building that software, as well as the build environment, right? So right now, a lot of this stuff happens completely out of band with humans being the controller, so to speak, right? It's an Excel document saying, hey, this vendor's been onboarded. These developers are part of our HR management system, right? So it's still a system of checking these attestations. It's just very manual. So when I think of supply chain policy, that's what I think of, right? And the more that we can move to an automated attestation framework and standardized data models to present these attestations, the more that we can automate policy over the attestations. So I think when I talked about verifiable evidence in the supply chain security paper, right, that's what I was talking about is, right, how do we have this, how do we verify this evidence in an automated way? And then we can automate the policy decision. Over.
I like that. Oh, sorry, I didn't raise my hand. Brandon, go ahead.
Yeah, I do kind of want to maybe take one step back and maybe talk about the audience and the scope first. I feel like that may help better inform the discussion there.
Yeah, and all I did for this here was copy and paste to start iterating from the original paper. And I highlighted the changes that I made. And there was also some of this stuff that felt like almost legal disclaimers that I put in lighter gray because I wasn't sure, if that was super. It definitely is relevant and important for the scope, but or like the non-goals, but I didn't know if it would apply as much to this.
Yeah, my first response was going to be, this sounds a lot like the initial white paper. My comments on it, I think, like based on the discussion we had last week, so I think the audience is going to be a little bit different from the original white paper. It's going to be like maybe a bit more executive management level as well. So I think that's one of my comments, and it sounds like the scope was my comment on the scope of recommendation best practices is like, yeah, we kind of did that, but now that I see that this is just a copy of that, that's why.
So I actually like what Cole had proposed, because this is something that I've learned like pretty recently, like yesterday, that what policy means for some people is not the same for what policy means for policy wonks. So like Cole said, when policy folks talk about policy, they talk about attestations. Like if someone who is giving you software says, I attest that I have a secure software supply chain. Or I attest that this artifact came from a secure supply chain. And then how would the person that's receiving it verify such a thing? Like verify that attestation. It's like, you verifying a claim, I suppose. And that's what I'm interested in. That's what I'm interested in. I don't know whether this is the forum for that.
I do want to make sure that by the end of this meeting, my goal is by the end of the meeting we should have these 4 sections filled out. Will seem to be, yeah.
So I here's the thing. Looking at this, and just by way of background, I've been doing so. I built Cisco's industrialized software supply chain management for both security and open source licensure back in the mid 2000s. So I've made a huge number of the mistakes available in the system over time. And what I can tell you is that if the goal of this is an executive level audience, the most valuable thing we can tell them is how to think about the problem and how to think about the limitations of how the problem can be addressed. Trying to recommend policy, quite frankly, at the current level of maturity of software supply chain is likely to make the world less secure rather than more. Because the number of misconceptions about how to think about this is tremendous. I had a conversation just yesterday with someone who had been implicitly presuming that their scans were accurate, for example. And that implicit assumption is extraordinarily dangerous. Now, scans are still useful, right? You may say, look, we've got some information here. It has known issues and defects. And so, but how to think about the problem. And like the number one thing to think about the problem is, in my mind, is to get them out of the one node mentality, right? I can't tell you how many conversations I've had over the years with people who think that RHEL is a component. RHEL's not a component, RHEL is a parts box. Or who are completely shocked when you sit down and do an apt-get install of a simple tool for them, and they discover that pulls in 157 different packages that they had no idea they were pulling in. Those base level misconceptions are rampant, particularly at the executive level. And so just helping them think about the problem and then project that into modesty around their processes is probably the most valuable thing we can do.
+1 from me.
Yeah, just to add a little bit more color to this, I had the exact same conversation with another person just yesterday about software bill of materials being generated from image scanners and the accuracy of those. And when I told him that they're about the limitations of their accuracy and so on, he said, I'm paraphrasing as best that I can, I did not know that they were inaccurate. Thank you for telling me, because this is going to change how I approach them, because now I know that they're not as what it did was it framed it into the correct level that he should trust it. Not to say that they're useless, but that he could use them when they don't have a more accurate way of generating them from their development teams, or that they, if they receive one from a vendor, that they could use it to analyze the accuracy of those SBOMs and open up a conversation with their vendors. So a lot of the conversations that are here, especially when we start talking about how do they create and write that policy, it's going to be a little bit interesting as we progress forward in terms of how do we make sure that we don't that the things we say are not interpreted in a way that they don't misunderstand. And I think with the term policy, what I tend to do with my teams is I tend to prefix the word policy with like governance policy to stand for like organizational level policy, or things like application policy for things that are executable, or so I think we can find other adjectives that we can put in that if we define them in the document, we'll make it very clear about exactly what kind of policy we're talking about. And we can probably do the same with other areas where there's overlap between terms between engineering and InfoSec teams, of which there's a lot of overlap of very nuanced differences that have profound impacts on the actions of people.
It's funny, I actually faced a completely different reaction when I say that scanners are not accurate, which is you lie. Of course they're accurate. And so that is really why I am reaching out to CNCF, Stack Security, because what I would like is something that can be found or like distributed to folks at the top level, so that they don't teach their the folks that report to them, these like myths that they just take for granted. I don't necessarily see that from CNCF at this time.
Yeah, the other thing I would suggest very strongly is that it is crucial that we get people to understand that software supply chains are not like hardware supply chains. That's a huge source of misunderstanding about the world, because it misses things, for example, like the degree to which you can actually enforce your policy. So for example, scanners are hugely inaccurate. I've had recent experience with them where they will point me at a CVE for a component that I don't have in the container at all, but they're firmly convinced that I've got that CVE to deal with. If you hit a developer with too many false positives to chase, they will start tuning out all the signal entirely. And this is something I had great fun 15 years ago explaining to hardware supply chain people. Software supply chain people can actually introduce dependencies without telling you. If you make their life sufficiently hard with the process, they will do that. And it's sort of like if someone could sneak into your factory at the middle of the night and weld chips on, or it's sort of like trying to figure out what's in, pardon me, because I'm a Cisco guy, what's in a router by taking a picture of the outside of the chassis with scanners, right? You can make guesses at it because maybe the cards have labels on the front, but you don't really know what's going on. And I think that level of we need to lead with that level of understanding for them, and then bring them back to right sizing what they're doing for the quality of what we can currently accomplish, right? Understood imperfections, but we're not sort of brushing it aside. We're just saying this is the limitations of what we can currently accomplish.
One quick note on those limitations. I've actually been thinking about coming up with a couple examples to drive through to demonstrate some of those. So back when I was helping with the software bill of materials, the minimum viable set that we were running, Plugfest, with the different generators, we created a application that could be used to, or rather, I used one of my applications so that they could use them during the SBOM test to check the dependencies of a Go library at the time, or of a Go application. And I think that there could be similar suggestions within a policy that how do you tell whether or not, like a canary, whether or not your system is even producing information. Not to say that it's 100% accurate or similar, but the fact that it's even producing something that even passed a sniff test. And so there may be things there that we can do to provide with some small level of information about the overall process as a policy that can be followed, or a procedure that can be followed. Probably more accurate.
My personal favorite on sniff test was I've had scanners tell me I need to upgrade my glibc on Alpine containers.
They're not wrong. No, well, they are wrong.
Upgrade being the operative word. Upgrade to glibc, you could argue, but
Yeah, so part of my thinking, it maybe didn't come across in fairly small modifications to like the scope statement, is the idea of the starting point of the conversation around this is with the other papers, it was how to build a secure software supply chain. I'm viewing this more of from the perspective of you have a software supply chain. It may or may not be secure. It is either at some level that your organization is comfortable with from a security perspective, either because you don't care or you've accepted risk and you want to maintain that level of compliance over time. As you know, the previous papers don't talk about things like, you know, that they referenced you should have some standard for what level or severity of CVEs could be committed into the code repository, but it doesn't discuss how often you should scan for vulnerabilities over time, because you know software atrophies as time goes on, and so you know here the recommendation or the whatever in the yellow TBD section would be like, what is the thing we tell people to do, whether it is a manual policy or an automated policy or creation of an attestation or whatever the thing is we put in our table of contents in more detail to follow, that helps you to either improve your supply chain over time or at least maintain that level of security. And I don't know if that makes sense. Maybe it conflicts with Brandon's desire to move this up more to the executive level. Personally, I have concerns with my own ability to communicate in a way that executives care about, because I don't have the same set of concerns they do. And I think this is why it's good to have all of you here, because I don't think I can do that part effectively.
Let me start with a strong opener, right? Because the executives are going to continue reading or not based upon the strength with which we grip them. They've got, you know, it's not that they have narrow attention spans. They've got 60 high quality decisions they have to make today. The time slicing is real. And you have to give them a reason to care, right? So the way I would typically open this, if I didn't have any notion of the sophistication of the executive I'm dealing with, is a very simple assertion. You have a software supply. If you use software, you have a software supply chain right now, whether you know it or not. And you're probably only aware of the tiniest, whether you know it or not. And then you can proceed from there, because a whole lot of people don't even understand that when they get a piece of software from somebody, there's this giant graph behind it, right? They think their supply chain, as I mentioned, means, oh, I got this from, you know, Yoyodyne Corp, and therefore my supply chain is Yoyodyne Corp. And that's just utterly false.
If you want to, you could also, in some companies, if they're large enough and critical enough, throw the regulatory book at them saying, U.S. government, if you're in that jurisdiction, is going to do this to you in the near future. You need to pay attention to it now. Otherwise, it's going to get very expensive very fast, and you won't have the ability to comply. And I've seen good results with that as well, though you can't do it in most places, but the largest places you can usually do that.
So one concrete piece of evidence for like the understanding of what you should do to secure a supply chain is, I have a link to the controls catalog. There is a set of controls called securing materials, and there is some mention of dependencies, but it's almost like from the perspective of the hardware supply, like from a hardware supply chain kind of view, where it's like, okay, I will get things from these particular vendors that I have contracts with, And so, it's enough if I just say that, yeah, I have these contracts with these vendors, and I'll do SEA on it and say like, okay, these are all the other things that I found. But that's not the whole story. And I feel like folks who are reading these controls will come to the conclusion that if they just do like an analysis on the stuff that they produce, they're good to go. And then.
Okay. Yeah. So the only thing I was gonna, and this is more just from the thinking about the, we're going to be talking to sort of the at the executive level. So I do think that one of the things we should also consider just is also the differences between various organizations' maturity around the supply chain problem. Like there are certain groups whose executives are very much aware of this, and then there's certain folks who, one of the things that I definitely hear from a lot of folks is at companies like, at tech focused companies, right? They are very obviously aware about supply chain. The executives might not know the details, but then you go to, let's say, a smaller software company, and they do not see the distinction between supply chain security and cybersecurity. They're just like, well, it's all the same to me. So I'd be curious to know, does it make sense for us to also be a bit clear in either saying like, these are the sorts of folks where we're very much trying to hit, like either folks who know nothing about supply chain security or have some understanding of supply chain security, at least at the problem statement level, or do we want to kind of hit all of them? I think that's kind of a question I have.
The problem is, my experience has been that the executives who think they know stuff about supply chain security, in excess of 50% of what they know is false. And that's the fundamental problem, I think. And I deal with a wide smattering of different levels of understanding, both inside and outside of the company. But like most executives who think they know something about supply chain security have a very large number of highly dangerous misconceptions. And part of it is getting back to Nisha's comment, we need to stop analogizing to the hardware supply chain. That does a universal disservice. And in fact, I think we should probably dispel that analogy early on in the document.
So if we, I see Frederick has his hand up.
Yeah, I also think one of the things that I'm realizing in these discussions as well is when you talk to executives, a large part of what helps the executives is also or to approach them is what your relationship is to that particular executive. So if you're the CISO talking to another executive, your conversations are going to be very different than you as an engineer talking to an executive trying to convince them of the same thing. Part of the challenge here, and this is why the scoping is so important for this particular document, is because if we're going to talk to executives, the executives we're most likely going to get to read the document are going to be CISOs. And usually CISOs fall into a spectrum that has two broad camps. One of them is you have CISOs who are very technical, and you have CISOs who are very good at organization. They're good at building organizations that are capable of discovering and mitigating risks, even if they don't understand the risks themselves. In both cases, they will also have people who report up to them who they trust. So that's also another possible target, is a CISO and their top security architect, which is different from an engineering architect. And so I think if we were to target, those two particular sections, if the idea is executive and their direct staff, those two would have the highest impact, because I'm very doubtful that we'll get even a CTO. CTO might read it out of curiosity, for the majority. Certainly, you're not going to get other executives to read into it. So my recommendation would be to focus on CISO, their immediate staff. I would recommend not focusing on the mid and lower range of the tiers at this particular point, because their ability to influence the organization, especially in a group like an InfoSec organization, is going to be highly limited, because there's a strong culture of, and I really dislike this, but a strong culture of staying in your swim lane. Don't affect other things. You have your responsibilities, you stick to it. And so that culture is going to play against us in getting effective change in any given organization that has a mid-level or above maturity.
The other thing I would suggest is, because of the focus that we have on SBOMs as a result of various executive orders and government policies, I've run into a whole bunch of people who are very aware of SBOMs and they have to do something around them. But when you try and broaden the conversation to supply chain security, that concept doesn't exist for them yet. And so introducing the broadening of that concept, that supply chain security is more than just running a scanner and producing an SBOM, may be of great value.
Ed is reading my mind.
I find that very deeply comforting, because I've done this for a long time, but for any given opinion I hold, it's always a question of whether I've dug myself a nice deep hole to nowhere or not. And so having other people go, that's exactly what I'm thinking, is super useful for me.
Well, having said that, I still wonder whether this is the... So is this the forum to talk about... I feel like there are two things that we're trying to accomplish here. One is create like an executive summary about the state of software supply chain, like software supply chain security in general. And the second thing we're trying to figure out is what should you be looking for? Like, there's like the organization side, like Frederick said, the organization side and the technical side. And so I'm thinking like an executive summary for the organization side, and then a checklist of sorts for the technical side.
So to chime in on that, I think the checklist work is something that the controls group does look at. So I think that's better suited for that group, given we already have the best practices and they've actually been doing the OSCAL stuff related to the SSDF as well. So I think, at least from my view, this group is more on the point that you're saying is like, how do we frame the problem? How do we get people to understand the problem? And the checklisting stuff is going to be the controls group mainly looking at that.
So I did reach out to John, who you told me to talk to. According to him, they are not interested in adding any more controls to that list of controls. I understand that. I am also of the opinion that set of controls doesn't talk about like actually like how to go and investigate a software supply chain. It just says like, you know, it's a bunch of make sure like use SCA. And we spent like a whole bunch of time talking about how SCA tools are bad or misleading or, you know, not ideal. So what's your recommendation on that side of the problem?
I think
Actually,
go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, if I can give some context here, because I was in the earliest calls for those and helped them with some of their scoping, and they may have changed their scoping. So it'd be good to peek into their current processes to validate this. The reason for the security controls group was not to be forward thinking like the way that we are here, but instead was to have a document that could help people who are compliance and auditors and similar to be able to tell, like, is this particular thing meeting the standards for, let's say, a base, no, not a baseline, but the standards for something like NIST SP 800-53, that when it says all data at rest must be encrypted, how do you validate and verify that? What are different ways that you can tie to that? The same with the ISO 27000 series as well. So I don't know exactly which ones they ended up binding to at the end of the day. I'm pretty confident that it's that's the NIST 853 is the one that they probably did. So the scope of that document was not for like how do we enact change, but is a very real problem today that auditors do not understand cloud native. They don't understand Kubernetes. When they come in to do an audit, they have no idea what they're looking at. So for the best practices that they tend to look for today, it's go point a scanner at it, which we know is terrible, but it's a meaningful step they can take today that does move the needle. And part of our path here is to eventually seed enough information and enough influence to change that so that they're not simply relying on a scanner. So that's the context as to why you're seeing it play out like that, is because of that background, assuming that my assumptions are correct still.
Yeah, and if that is a gap, then obviously that's part of what we have to do to kind of flag that, and the controls group may have to evolve in terms of what it's doing to encapsulate the work that we're doing in this working group as well. So I think that's more a separate conversation of like how do we have the controls working group and talk to them to see whether this would be this would be the next horizon of things that they would do, because I think they're pretty much just refining what they currently have, and then the next step will be looking for something new to look at. So I will take an action item to maybe I'll set up a meeting with John to discuss this, and Nisha and whoever else wants to chime in on that as well, send me a ping, and then we can kind of like brainstorm a little bit and figure out where that piece of work should live. Awesome. Nice. All right.
So
yeah,
and I'm Cole. I haven't had a chance to pull up your your comments as I'm thinking this through. We'll definitely feel free to edit in this talk directly, or I'll copy and paste those in after. What I am hearing, and this is probably not accurate, is the beginning of a almost a like doom and gloom paper about why supply chain security is so terrible today. I'm wondering what the hook is for like I don't think we need to stop there. We need the hook into and so this is what you can do, or like how this is how do we make the world better, and the world being like your.
But you're 1,000,000% right. We don't want to get too doom and gloomy, but we need to paint the picture correctly, right? Because it is actively dangerous for people to feel more secure than they are, right? And so some of what we can point out is by pointing out the gaps, you attract attention to them. So for example, if we get CISO level attention to this, talking about the gaps in the system, the mere articulation of those gaps will attract energy towards trying to solve them, right? But I think there's a certain degree to which we need to be balanced in telling people like what they're actually buying with things, because we've all taken pot shots at scanners here, right? And I am probably the worst offender on that front. But it is often true that something is better than nothing. But if you think that something is accurate, you're going to waste a lot of energy in inappropriate ways. If you think it makes you secure when it doesn't, you're going to, I mean, there's this effect, I'm trying to remember the name of it, that basically shows that when you install new safety devices and things, people actually take more risk and the net mortality rate doesn't go down. And so, you know, you introduce seatbelts and airbags and all the rest of it, and the mortality rate isn't as impacted as you thought because they take more risks now that there's more safety. If that safety perception is false, you've made the world worse. And that's what we most passionately need to avoid, is making the world worse.
Yeah, and I also don't like. I think it's like a little bit is letting people know, like it's like painting the right picture. But I also think that, you know, there's a lot of newer executives that will come up and read this, and you know, this gives them a kind of good base to start with as well.
So is any of what we've talked about so far policy?
Well, I think part of what we're coming around to is that it may be premature to try and phrase policy. We're dealing with people who have no capacity to evaluate how to put policy forth. And like anything else, if you push things like trying to put policy forth too soon, people are going to make mistakes that are going to make it harder to correct in the future because they'll have the painful memory of the last time. So what I guess what we may want to do is broaden our consideration into how do we educate people at sort of like that CISO and the next step down level in order to allow them to effectively engage with supply chain security.
What would you say is like the type of language we should be engaging in? Like it's because policy comes to mind in terms of like these are what becomes the output, or is there something else that we should be talking as a medium to engage this audience? I see hands up, so I'll shut up and let people talk.
I can go. I actually had an experience dealing with this kind of situation. So when I wanted to talk about supply chain security, software supply chain security, to like a VP of security or a CISO, it's basically a doom and gloom document that says everything is broken, because apparently that's what gets that kind of person fired up. On the other hand, if I wrote the document, and I actually tried to do this, I converted the CISO document into a product document. When I converted it into a product document, it was more like, nobody's thinking about it in this way. This is a great opportunity for you to make money because there's like 40, what is it? There's $200 billion of market, what's the term called? I'm not a marketer. It's like market, addressable market. That's the one. That's the term. There's like 200 billion in addressable market. Customers want this. They will be asking for it. So the other side is like, hey, there's money to be made over here. But these two, like they're diametrically opposite personality types. And I'm wondering which personality type does this group want to speak to? I think Frederick was next.
Yeah, I think part of it. So, like, what group we want to address is definitely the most important question. I think part of the path, though, is when we are looking at how we want to approach. Let's assume for a moment it's CISO and their directs. If that's the group, almost every conversation that I have with a CISO or with one of the directs is it always includes what are the resources necessary to implement this. They're looking at it from, because at the end of the day, they're all of the risk and so on. They have a giant list of things that they have to take care of, a list of things that they have to do, list of things they want to do. And every single one of them takes resources in some way. And so if we're asking them to put resources towards supply chain security, software supply chain security, we're asking them to take resources from somewhere else. And so it becomes very important to talk about why decreasing the risk here is more valuable than increasing the risk somewhere else where they don't pay where they either don't put money towards it, or they don't put people and resources towards it. And so automation helps with this. So anything that we can automate, even things out of supply chain that we automate, increase our ability to participate in this particular space. But it all comes down to what is the value of the thing that I'm protecting? What is the cost to protect it? What is the difference between the value and the cost, which gets you what's called the residual value? And that residual value is basically the possible profit margin that the company will be looking at. So we have to keep the economics in mind every time we have these discussions, and either paint a story of how this is important because of the risk and liability, or this is important because it'll help accelerate you in these other areas, that accelerate the business in these other areas, which turns into more long-term money that can then be used to apply into the particular space. And sometimes there also may be plenty of money, but just no people to do it as well. So you also have to keep that in mind. What I'm saying, though, is tie it back down to the economics every time. Tie it down to lights on budgets, CapEx, OpEx. Like these are the things they're thinking about day in and day out.
Michael?
Yeah. So to take actually a step back, I think one of the things that I liked that Ed was saying, I think I'd be interested to know if we could also, just for some of the stuff that we could list out maybe some of the documents that sort of already exist, and like maybe what their intended audience are, and sort of try and figure out where some of those gaps are, as well as figure out, like, are there things that we found to be unsuccessful? Because, like, I mean, for the past several years, right, there's been a ton of documents released on supply chain security, all for lots of different audiences and whatever. And it does sound like some of them, and I don't know any of the, I'm not calling anybody out specifically, but it sounds like some of them might not have been particularly successful, or ended up causing more confusion because of one reason or another. So I think sort of seeing also where things have not been successful in the past in trying to hit the audience we're trying to hit, that executive audience, to try and hit all the things that Ed, Frederick, Nisha, et cetera, have all been saying, I think would be really valuable. Because I know that with a lot of stuff that's come out, I know that one of the big questions that's gonna come up is, an executive says, hey, I already read the such and such document that is supposed to be a policy document on, or a executive summary on supply chain security. Why should I read yours? Is going to be an interesting question.
And I would say the best answer to that is because we tell them the unvarnished truth and nobody else is.
I was wondering if there was a specific, and I wonder if this conflicts with what you just said, Ed, like a specific pitch for the value that CNCF can offer to this, in terms of the solutions in the space, the community solving these problems and moving it forward. At the same time, like we don't want to tell them the unvarnished truth just to try and sell our own solution. We want to do it because there's real value there. All right, we've got about 2 or 3 minutes left. I will be out on spring break next week, so I don't know. I'm assuming most everybody else will be here probably.
Wait, spring break starts next week?
Well, it actually started today. I don't know. Schools are absurd these days. The kids are never in class anymore. I have to take so many days off with the kids at home. It's ridiculous. But anyway, yeah. So we'll be out of town next week. So maybe if anybody has ideas for what to do, and I can async work on trying to reframe some of the audience and scope and take in what I've heard. But any other thoughts or ideas about what to do to prepare for next week, or what the conversation next week should be? I know, Brandon, you were hoping for us to really tie down these particular areas today, but I don't know if we're there.
It sounds to me like we did come to a consensus that an executive level document is required. So
Yeah,
that's a good step.
Yeah, I think we have general fuzzy-ish consensus on this. So I think this is at least we have that alignment. I think the conversation was a lot more focused today than it was 2 weeks ago. So I think that's a good sign.
Do y'all still want me to put the measurement, the salsa, transitive salsa table that I created to measure supply chain stuff here?
I would love to see it in the chat just because I'm an infovore, and more information is better.
It's something that I created for my organization. It's also something that I have often talked openly about the limitations of salsa. So yeah, I'll put it in here.
Michael or Frederick?
So from my perspective, I think we should just if possible be ready next meeting to sort of make the decision, vote on it or whatever. So if we can, I'm totally down to put in some thoughts into the various sections here around the audience scope, not goals and assumptions. But I think we should probably make sure that, by next meeting, unless there's some big, point of argument, then we should, agree on it.
Yeah, I'm really happy with the given direction. We started talking and arguing a lot about policy, but we ended up here, which I think is excellent, because the way that you get the policy enactment is going to be through informing of the executives and getting their buy-in. And it's up to them to work out the wording that is tailored for their individual organization. So every organization will have a different wording that is specific to how they want to approach the problem at an organization level. So I believe this is the most effective approach, is not to target the policy directly, but instead to target the executives and their staff, so that if they're informed on the decisions, then they can write things that are well scoped, but also, as Ed pointed out, that we don't go overboard and get them to write, help them help them work out where the limitations are, so that when they come down to actually writing those policies, that they don't overscope them. So, like, knowledge here is by far the most important tool that we can give them.
Sounds good. So I guess let's get edits in. I would say 2 days before the meeting next week, so that you have time to at least go through cleanup before we look at it.
Sounds good. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate the time and the support and all of the feedback. Great conversation as always.